ICMP is used for pings to see if you have a connection, and for things like traceroute to find out what routers a packet goes through, and for other things like when an error condition occurs, you can send an ICMP message back saying packet undeliverable for some reason. And so here's traceroute. You send things with a TTL of 1, so at the very first hop, it will expire and it'll send you back time exceeded. So you gather these time exceeded methods and you can trace what series of routers a packet goes through. Jiggler, nowhere to upload it on Canvas. If you can just send a message through the Canvas message system if you want to. If it's a YouTube video, which would be best, you can just put a URL in a message. That's easiest for us to examine. Anyway, all right, so that's traceroute. You can send any kind of packets. Unix and Cisco use UDP. Microsoft sends ICMP. Anyway, all right, and Telnet is terminal emulation. This sends commands to a command line controller on the server, but no encryption. It's an old protocol. Nobody should really be using it for anything anymore. Should be using secure shell instead. This is encrypted Telnet, much safer, of course. FTP is like Telnet, sends data unencrypted and the passwords if you have a password to log in. It also uses ports in a strange way that is difficult for firewalls to handle. FTP is a really old protocol like Telnet that really shouldn't be used. What's better is TFTP is another one used to upload firmware that doesn't even have any passwords at all. It's only intended to connect two devices on a local area network to upload firmware to an IP phone or a router. And SSH is the secure replacement for Telnet, like we said, and it has SFTP and SCP, which are ways to move files around with encryption, much more secure than the older protocols. There used to be some R login protocols and R shell for Unix, and those are like Telnet. They don't encrypt anything and are out of date. SSH had an old vulnerable version, but there's a new standard SSH v2, which is better. Right, SMTP is used to send mail between servers, and you can retrieve mail from a server to your client if you're running a client like Outlook, Express, or Eudora with POP3 or IMAP, but almost nobody does that anymore. Almost everybody uses Outlook Web Access or Gmail or something where your mail lives on a server and you just view it through a browser, and the mail actually is never stored on your local machine at all. DNS, of course, resolves alphabetic names like ccsf.edu into IP addresses, and it runs over UDP and TCP53. These days, more of it goes over, TCP53 is used by some of it. Someone's using extend DNS to send 4,096 bytes over UDP. The problem is, now that we have DNSSEC signed records, the responses are much bigger than they used to be because they include big blobs of cryptography for signatures and such. Anyway, DNS server's start of authority is the master record for a zone. Every domain like ccsf.edu has to have a server as its start of authority, which is the authoritative place where you can find all the servers with names ending in ccsf.edu. If it's not on the start of authority, that server is not public, doesn't exist. Recursive servers are what you have at home in your router, where you ask it where things are, and if it doesn't know, it will ask somebody else and find out for you. A caching server stores recently resolved names. There's one of these built into Windows, but not into Linux. So if you have, you go back to the same domain within a period of time, like perhaps 2 minutes, it won't ask for the IP address again, it will just remember it. So DNS has a lot of weaknesses. It uses UDP, so there's no handshake, no reliability, no authentication. A 16-bit source port and a 16-bit query ID is all it uses to identify when it asks another server for DNS information. The only way it can tell that the reply came from that server is by matching these 32 bits. If an attacker can guess both numbers, they can lie and poison the cache. And this was the Nan Kaminsky attack that was really famous. And people fixed it in the short run by randomizing the source port number to go from 16 bits of randomness to 32 bits of randomness, which in fact lowered the risk down to a very low level. In the long run, upgrading to DNSSEC would fix it further, but that's been like more than a decade. We've slowly been implementing DNSSEC, and it's not being deployed in any useful way yet. The DNSSEC adds cryptographic authentication and integrity to these things, very slowly being rolled out across the internet. And you can use online dig if you want to escape the vagaries of your local network. And the people in my DNS class often had to do this because DNS is often filtered and limited. So you can go to online looking glasses, like one at Men and Mice. There's another one at Ring of Saturn. There's a bunch of these DNS looking glasses where you can get direct connections to the backbone of the internet unfiltered to do queries and find out what's really going on out there. And so if you do a request like this one, I dig everything from ietf.org. I get a bunch of these signatures like you see at the bottom, these long blobs of base64 stuff. That's a resource record signature. And so if your browser or your DNS server is configured correctly for DNSSEC, it will then verify that cryptographic stuff and make sure that the data you got is in fact from the trusted source. All right, SNMP is used to monitor and control network devices. This is a really old protocol, and it was typically used very unsafely. Without encryption, it would send community strings, and there was even default numbers, words almost always used for public and private. So old firewalls and routers and switches and servers use this really insecure protocol. Nowadays, there's SNMP v3 that adds encryption and is much better, but a lot of people have legacy devices still using SNMP version 2. HTTP is to deliver web pages without encryption. It's almost extinct now. Almost everybody has upgraded to HTTPS on port 443 with strong encryption. And BootP is a really old protocol which was an alternative to, there's a way to load Bootstrap protocol to boot from the internet. You might use it for something like a thin client that doesn't even have a hard drive. It just downloads the whole OS every time it boots up. And DHCP was intended to replace BootP. It can deliver things like this. All right, anyway, all right, that's what delivers IP addresses to machines when they boot up. So let's try another Kahoot. We're up to 4D. Oh, good. Jiggler, I see you did the right thing. Good. All right. Hacker Kitty learned about the Unicodes. All right. All right. So which utility sends a series of packets with different TTL values? That's traceroute. Okay, good. All right, which utility performs file transfers with no password? That's TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. Telnet typically has a password. It's sent without encryption. TFTP has no ability to send a password at all, so it's really intended to just be traveled down a wire from the server to your IP phone or something. Shouldn't really be used on the public internet. Which protocol goes on port 22? secure shell, SSH, used to control Linux servers all the time. All right, which protocol uses RRSig records? That's DNSSEC, to add cryptographic signatures to DNS data. All right. Good. Well, we got time to do one more. That'll keep us on track. All right. So, network architecture and design. So, in cabling terms, at layer 1, electromagnetic interference is when you have electricity get into the wires, typically from fluorescent lights or something like that. That's bad. You can also leak from one wire to another, as one wire emits radio signals and the other absorbs it. That's one problem, crosstalk. Attenuation is just the weakening. The resistance of the wire causes the voltage of the signal to decline as you go down a long cable. So these are all various problems with traffic going through a cable. Unshielded twisted pair has a bunch of twisted pairs carrying data, and each twist is a different number of twists per inch, so that the crosstalk will tend to cancel out. And this is the cheapest and most common type of cabling. It's not shielded. It doesn't have any protection from external interference like fluorescent lights, but it is the cheapest and most flexible form of cable. So you have various categories. Cat 3 is the one that got popular at 10 megabits per second. Now pretty much everybody's around Cat 6. I think there's even like Cat 7 and 8 now, things that can carry gigabit of traffic. So shielded twisted pair just adds a layer of tinfoil shielding outside it just to protect it from electromagnetic waves from the outside. That makes it more rigid and expensive than UTP. And then coax is what your cable TV comes in. It has a single conductor in the middle, then a braided sheath on the outside, a dielectric insulating material in the middle, and then a plastic sheath on the outside to protect it from sunlight and water and such. And this creates a waveguide which has a real high bandwidth, higher bandwidth than UDP or STP, a high quality waveguide to send radio frequencies through the cable. And fiber optic is the fastest of all. It sends infrared light pulses through a piece of glass. The glass is a very thin fiber, and it's immune to electromagnetic interference, and it has very low attenuation and is much faster. It can send a signal 50 miles. The only problem is the cable itself is not more expensive, but the NICs at the end, the network interface devices at the end, are more expensive. So multimode fiber has a wide channel, like 50 to 60 or 62.5 microns, so it has multiple paths. The light might go straight down the middle, or it might take glancing blows going up and down in a diagonal path. So that will mean some of the light takes a longer path and gets slowed down, so it smears out the light, and that lowers the bandwidth. So multimode fiber is cheaper to use because you can use cheap LED sources, but it only goes a shorter distance before the light smears out and limits the bandwidth. Single mode is where you have one very narrow fiber in the middle, typically 6 microns, so only one possible path is allowed of the infrared light. That's why I call it single mode. So there is no dispersion, or much less dispersion. This goes much further. You have more expensive network interface cards at the end, but it goes much further and much faster. This is what all the undersea cables are all using, single mode fiber. Wavelength division multiplexing is where you send multiple different wavelengths through the same piece of glass, so you just send even more data through it. And you can exceed 10 gigabits per second this way. All right. So Ethernet is what we're almost all using for physical wires. Originally used a physical bus topology with coaxial cables, but now it's all using physical star topology with twisted pair cables. As I said, baseband, one channel. If two nodes transmit simultaneously, you can have a collision. All right, so here's the old stuff. Thin net and thick net are the old ones with long coaxial cables, stiff coaxial cables like water hoses. Now everybody's been using the star arrangement with twisted pair cables going to one central device, which is like a hub or a switch. So Ethernet, when you use hubs, has a problem with collisions. Since the hub is stupid, two devices can try to transmit at the same time, and they transmissions will add up together and explore on non-allowed voltage ranges. So that's where it senses a multiple access collision detection. And when that happens, it sends a jamming signal to tell everybody there's been a collision. Then it has a random time delay, and then it retransmits the packets, the frames, I should say, to try to avoid that collision. That's a collision, sends a jam signal, waits a random amount of time to retransmit. CSMA collision avoidance is what wireless networks use, because wireless signals do not have a forbidden voltage range. Because wireless signals fall out as the inverse square of the distance from the antenna, it could be high voltage or lower voltage, and in both cases just be a single packet and if two frames collided, you wouldn't have any way to know that happened. So it can't do this. So in wireless networks, instead of everybody sending whenever they want to and resolving collisions, you have to avoid collisions. So first you send a signal saying, I'm about to talk, everybody shut up. Then you send your signal, then you say, I'm done talking, you can talk now. This is why wireless networks waste about half their bandwidth arguing about who's going to talk next. They're less efficient in that regard than wired Ethernet networks. All right, ArcNet and Token Ring are older protocols used. Both of these avoided collisions by having a token. You would have a ring and you'd pass a token, and if you want to send anything, you have to wait for the token to come to you. Then you can attach your data to the token, it'll go to the destination, and then go around again. So there's no issue of collisions. Instead, you wait your turn to speak. They sound more logical, but they did not win in the marketplace. The sloppier Ethernet protocol that has collisions and fixed them turned out to make cheaper network interface cards and cheaper routers and cheaper switches and hubs, so you could make a faster network for cheaper. With sloppy old Ethernet, these organized token ring things did not last. FDDI was another one like this, using 2 fiber rings. It was fault tolerant. If you cut the ring, it could still send data the other way, down the other ring, and ran at 100 megs. Was considered pretty good a few decades ago. Nowadays, it's a legacy protocol. Nobody would install a new one these days. There might be some old ones still in use. By the way, this is the protocol I couldn't remember before. Token Ring was the protocol that sent something like 10 kilobytes of data in a single frame. So if you had a Token Ring network connect to an Ethernet network, it had to do segmentation at layer 3, fragmentation at layer 3 to move the traffic through. Anyway, then there's physical topologies. A bus is this where you just have one line and connect them together. So if a single break goes in, somebody's isolated from the whole network. This is like the old-fashioned Christmas tree lights, where one bulb burns out, the whole chain of lights goes down. Tree, or hierarchical, you have a root node and then a branching tree. The root is typically something like a mainframe. That's another way to do it. A ring is what we talked about. Token Ring does this. FDDI does this, where you have a ring of traffic. Logic and physical ring. The actual cables are laid out this way. Star is what we all are pretty much using these days. You have a central device, which is usually a switch, and every endpoint has its own cable to go there. So if one of the cables breaks, just one device stops receiving service, but the others do. Now, Token Ring was wired up this way, but then it operated as a logical star. It would use the connection to send a token here, 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 going around the ring. And mesh is what you have. We have multiple paths for superior availability, like the internet. There are many ways to get there, so now if one cable breaks, everybody can continue to get service because they can just take a different route. It takes many cables to break before anybody actually loses service. All right, that's the last bit for today. Let's do the last Kahoot, which is 4E, which is down here. Lost on the purpose of Token Ring. Token Ring just served the same purpose as Ethernet. It was just an older technology. And for a while, there was a brief period of time when Token Ring went up to 16 megabits per second, and Ethernet was still down at like 10 and really only delivered 5. So it was just a competitor in the really early days of Ethernet. It was another way to wire up a local area network. But the switch in the center and the network cards cost more than Ethernet. And when Ethernet made it to 100 megs, for cheaper, that was pretty much the end of Token Ring. So that's all. Yep. I would have thought Token Ring would win because it's more logical to not have those collisions. But turns out, having collisions and resolving them delivered more data faster, cheaper. It was the winner. Same thing like beta and VHS. People tell me beta was actually the superior quality, but it lost in the marketplace to VHS. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts trying to figure out why it is that when you have the whole internet full of data, people prefer the junk. But apparently this has always been the case. They say when the printing press first came out, the most popular book was a book about how to identify and kill witches. So the fact that it was all garbage, but sensational, made it more fun than like, a serious science book. So anyway, it's called Gresham's Law in economics. Bad money drives out good. Anyway. Popular things are often not the best. Well, I guess we'll carry on. Had a few casualties. All right. So if you put your cables near fluorescent lights, what happens? Electromagnetic interference. Fluorescent lights are sort of like lightning. They're sending out a lot of bursts of radio, which leak in and foul up your data transmission. All right, what's the most common type of Ethernet cable? UTP, unshielded twisted pair, is the cheapest and most common for that reason, good enough for normal use. Shielded twisted pair is perhaps better, but it's more expensive and usually you don't need it. All right, which LAN used 2 fiber rings? FIDI, that was it. All right. And what physical topology does Ethernet use? I'm missing an L in the word topology. It's a star. You have one central device, the switch, and you have a cable going to each endpoint from that central device. All right, good. All right, I'm going to stop recording.